Good morning, everybody. Welcome. All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to this event, Unmasking Sinclair's Propaganda Machine. I appreciate you all for being with us this morning. My name is Dayvon Love. I'm Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. I'll have the panelists introduce themselves momentarily. Let me just first, give you all, for those who may not be familiar with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, grassroots political think tank, independent black political organization. And we operate, explicitly from a revolutionary Pan-African nationalist perspective, meaning that for us, our political North Star is African sovereignty, people of African descent having the ability to practice self-determination as a basis for freedom struggle. So that's kind of the underlying worldview and perspective that LBS's work emanates from. There are a variety of issues that we have worked on where the presence of Sinclair in the political landscape has impacted some of the policy initiatives that we've been engaged in over the last several years. And so you're going to hear a discussion that ranges a variety of different topics, different issues that the Sinclair broadcasting media empire, has impacted the landscape. So the basic format of the discussion is going to be pretty straightforward. I'm going to be engaged in conversation with our panelists, and then I'll give the audience an opportunity to engage the conversation, make commentary, ask questions, and then we're actually, at the end, we're going to announce a policy initiative that we're going to embark on during the 2027 legislative session related to this topic. So that's just the general format of our conversation this morning and afternoon. All right, so let's jump right into it. So, there are general conversations about media criticism and the relationship that black folks have to the larger media ecosystem in the society. So, for instance, when you think about the way that black folks were covered during Nat Turner's rebellion, and you think about the fact the press covered Nat Turner's rebellion in the same way that people might imagine, someone covering a terrorist incident, right? This idea, the way that it was often characterized as these bloodthirsty folks that are interested in pillaging and harm, as opposed to being clear that we're talking about enslaved people that are taking up arms against their oppressor, right, in very similar ways that one might characterize the American Revolution, right, the same way that the American colonists, understood the importance of fighting for their freedom. Right now, there's questions as to whether or not we should constitute that freedom. America's a separate colony. It's a separate but related conversation. But the point being made here is that the nature of black folks being covered by the media generally has often undermined the humanity of people of African descent. What makes Sinclair Broadcasting and David Smith's ownership of the Baltimore Sun more pernicious is that he and his media empire is actively engaged in the kind of Maryland and Baltimore political landscape in a way that is very explicit. If you read, there's a 2024 Baltimore Banner article where they quote the conversation. So they recorded the conversation that David Smith had with the staff when he bought the newspaper. And so when you read that Baltimore Banner article, he actually talks about the ways that he engages politics. He talks about confronting the presiding officers in the legislature. He talks about the way that he uses polls, right, as a way to kind of set the political climate. He even talks about the Question K. So folks that are familiar with Question K, that put the ballot term limits onto the ballot in 2022. He described that as a test, right? So for those of us, that may be frustrated with, elected officials, being elected based off of name recognition and the like, taking advantage of that. But for David Smith, the person that put almost $400,000 into that initiative, that was a political test, right? So there's something particularly pernicious about a media company and a newspaper that has specific political objectives. And LBS has really identified a few of those political objectives that in many respects have been at odds with our own political agenda, particularly, in the area of demonizing young people. There's a sentencing project report that says that 53% of Fox 45's coverage is of so-called juvenile crime, right, even though they only constitute 7% of the, crime committed across the state of Maryland. The demonization of community-based violence prevention. So you see Safe Streets and increasingly We Are Us, organizations that many of us believe have been the driving force of the declines of homicides and violence in Baltimore City. We see Sinclair Broadcasting and David Smith's media empire demonizing the work. Many of those formerly incarcerated who've been central to the work of driving down homicides and violence. And then, as I just mentioned, putting ballot initiatives on the ballot. The most recent one, Question H, which would have reduced the size of the Baltimore City Council from 14 members to 8 members. LBS, the Maryland Green Party, and a variety of other organizations came together to fight to stop Question H. Unfortunately, we were successful in stopping that ballot initiative from shrinking the size of the Baltimore City Council. So those are just a few examples of really explicit ways that Sinclair Broadcasting has participated in an explicit political agenda on the Maryland and Baltimore political landscape. So we've assembled a panel here to discuss the different ways that Sinclair, as a media company, has operated in many respects as a right-wing political advocacy organization. And so we're going to discuss the just different range of ways that has shown up. So we have first Stephen Janis. Stephen Janis, so I'll ask you to introduce yourself.
Sure.
And then also my question to you, because you actually worked at Sinclair at one point, so I want you to talk about that.
Sure.
And then I want you to talk about, based on your reporting, how has the Smith family benefited from public dollars, and what stake do they have in how Baltimore is covered in the media?
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the question. My name is Stephen Janis. I'm a Capitol Hill correspondent for the Real News Network and investigative reporter, and I worked at Sinclair, I think from like 2011, 2015. But a couple of years ago, we did a very extensive investigation into city finances and the relationship to the Sinclair family. And what we uncovered was the fact that, I don't know if any of you have been to Harbor East, I'm sure you have, it's beautiful entertainment zone, but it's also heavily subsidized by the taxpayers. And the Sinclair family, with their ties to the Paterakis family, have benefited significantly. We found in a 10-year period $110 million in city tax incentives going to Sinclair. And what's really interesting about it is that, you were talking about the propaganda and how Sinclair has this city in crisis, and they're constantly writing or producing stories about what I call the failed city narrative in Baltimore. Meanwhile, they are benefiting significantly, like hundreds of millions, at least tens of millions of dollars in tax incentives that are benefiting their company. And, Sinclair's always had this weird relationship with government. They, I think they, especially with the city, they tend to be in a constant sort of using the city as fodder for the city is falling apart, et cetera, et cetera. However, they benefit tremendously from the government. Their entire business model is based on government. I mean, the spectrum they get to run their broadcast stations is a public asset that was given to them. And then when the government needed some of it back that they weren't using, they made the government buy it back. Their entire business model has depended upon government handouts, basically, and particularly in Harbor East, because Harbor East would not be there without the taxpayers of Baltimore City. So what this really amounts to, I think, on a much larger scale is this idea that Baltimore is a failed city. And they can exploit that through, having this narrative that it's a failed city, but at the same time take money from the city and the taxpayers to fund their business. It's really, really strange. And, I asked an ethics expert in journalism, I said, shouldn't they declare this when they do a story about how messed up Baltimore, that we receive money from the city? And she said, absolutely yes. So every night Sinclair should be, before we run the story, this would be, proper journalism ethics. We need to tell you that we're receiving, I don't know how much, it was very hard to get the tax numbers. The city is not completely transparent about how many of these tax breaks go to where, to whom, for how long. But they should be declaring every night, that we benefit tremendously from the taxpayers of Baltimore City, but they don't. And I think that shows that there is a not just a conflict of interest, but a really bizarre, twisted, cruel relationship between the residents of Baltimore City and Fox 45, because they use this city as sort of their, I guess it would be, some pick on it to create a narrative that this city has failed. I think it has a lot to do, you can talk more about this, but the fact that, it's a majority African-American city and it has African-American politicians, and I think that's a big part of it. And I saw a lot of things. I left Sinclair in 2015 because they had taken a video clip of, everyone knows, very respected activist Tawanda Jones, edited it down and said she was advocating for killing cops. And no one in the newsroom knew who she was, or enough to call her and ask her before they ran the story. The story became a huge controversy, and I was like, I got to get out of here. But fortunately, I found the real news, which is great. But, it is I think this city has been set up to fail, and they're propping up on it from being able to create stories from it. And then on the other hand, while they're saying Baltimore is this horrible city, taking money, on the back end from the city taxpayers. So, thank you.
Yep. No, appreciate that. So Ashley, as an elected school board member, I think folks who are familiar with Fox 45, and the nature of their coverage on the education system, you being an elected school board member, sit in a unique vantage point to see the impact of the coverage that Sinclair has of the education system. So what impact has Sinclair had on the education landscape in Maryland, and what are some of the things that yourself and others or any of us can do to counter the impact that they're having on the education landscape?
Great question. Hi everyone. I'm Ashley Eposito. I'm an elected school board member. I've served since 2023. I'm a mom of a 6-year-old in city schools. And I also serve on the school board steering committee for Local Progress, which is a national organization that supports progressive elected officials. And I also serve at a state level with both the Maryland Commission on Indian Affairs Education Committee and MABE, which is the Maryland Association of Boards of Education. And what I see locally is that we are covered very different, but we're also covered very similarly to Chicago. And I think to your point, like being a majority black city, and them also wanting to connect this all to like Project 2025, which is solely about, well, not solely, but a big portion of it is about dismantling public education. And how do you do that? You need people to have distrust. In a city like ours where, a lot of the things that they're saying are the alternative to public education, like school choice, charter schools, like we have those. And it's not, I think that we proactively kind of created a situation where we have charter schools, but it doesn't operate the same way that charter schools did in Texas and Arizona, where, you had vouchers and the money attached to the kids, and it was easily able to defund public education. But here we've kind of have the things that they say are the alternative, but they don't talk about that at all. They focus solely on our CEO, both our previous CEO and the current one, and on the school board. And a lot of the narrative is that we're corrupt, that our kids can't read, which is not true. They cherry pick data from, our annual scores or our report cards. But even those, there was a point in time where Baltimore City Public Schools was actually doing well and improving at an accelerated rate in scores, and then the scoring system changed. And then when you're talking about the fact that we are over analyzing kids, I know when I was in school, some of the expectations of what they have for kids now are way different. Kindergarten, for example, my kiddo just graduated kindergarten, and I remember, it was oh, can you make it through the day as a whole kid, and do you know your alphabet? That was the bar. Now they're expected, when you say proficiency, you really have to dig into what does proficiency mean on paper, and what that means, because Fox puts that out there all the time, saying the kids aren't proficient. The kids in Maryland aren't proficient because what the bar is for kindergarten is for them to be able to write a paragraph, like a small paragraph, like short sentences, but it's not the same education system or expectations as it was when we were kids. But they are not telling that story. And then the other thing, during my reelection campaign, I decided not to talk to Sinclair, not to talk to Chris Papps, and to publicly boycott and go on the historical record, because one of the things that I was told behind the scenes, something wasn't sitting well in my spirit, because the first time we ran, one of the things that people don't know is that the top 4 candidates, there was an email that was sent to us from their team saying, hey, here's a list of questions, but you can only answer yes or no. These were the most gotcha questions I've ever seen. There was so much like nuance that you could not answer these questions yes or no at all. Like they're like, we want to do a chart and we want to compare y'all against each other. The 4 of us at that point were very tight. So we talked and we're like, we ain't doing it. Like, no, we all emailed back and we're like, no, these questions that you're asking, like, it is not in good faith. If you want to have a real conversation, we can do that. And they ended up never, like, pushing any further than that, and they didn't do the story at all. So in that moment, I recognized, oh, we actually have some leverage. So when I ran again, I was like, you know what? I've seen what they've done. Even in my role when I got on the board, they asked for an exclusive interview, and there was a lot of pushback from the district because they're like, we've been through this before. We know what they're going to do. They're going to paint y'all in a terrible light. They're going to take these tiny clips and, mesh them all together and take it completely out of context, and we won't have control. So one of the things that we did strategically was record the interview. So we had our own accountability tool to say, hey, if we got to drop this and show the full interview and how you ask the questions, and that shook them too. They were pissed, like behind the scenes when they were setting up for this interview, to see that we had the audacity to have our own record of like how they conduct these interviews and hold them accountable. So re-election comes. I'm like, you know what? I'm not doing it. Absolutely not. I don't feel like dealing with this dude. And people freaked out. Like, other elected officials believe that you have to engage with them, that all press is good press. And that is not true. Because what I've heard from our kids is that Fox will show up when something really, really terrible happens, like when one of your classmates dies, or when, this random thing happens in the school, like a one-off thing. And they will cover it and they will play it and they will broadcast it nationally. I've had family members in rural areas in other states tell me, like, reach out to me and be like, oh, are you all okay at city schools? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Because they're being targeted by ads, in other areas. So this is clickbait for them. So I'd be interested to see how much money they're making off of news stories about Baltimore City, Chicago, Minneapolis, everywhere else. And for me, I couldn't do that to the kids. I can't, as somebody that's in a leadership role in the school system, I can't stand up there in good faith and act like this is a chill interview when I know the mental health impact that they are having on the kids. Because the one thing that the kids told me is that they were like, they never show up for anything good that we do. They never tell any stories about anything good that we do, or, all that. They were naming all types of things that have been good that have gotten no media coverage. And for our educators and people in our school system that come to work every day, all this corruption and foolery that they're talking about, it is a normal workplace. Like, there are just people working, showing up to work, trying to do a good job under that type of pressure cooker. So I just encourage folks to, boycott Fox, boycott Sinclair. Like, that's what we can do. And also hold elected officials accountable to don't believe that they have to talk to Sinclair to win. Because, obviously I was the top vote getter while actively boycotting them.
So Lawrence, so introduce yourself. But also, why do you believe that David Smith Sinclair has chosen to target particularly stigmas regarding black youth? We heard about, the way that education is covered. So talk about why you believe that a focus, particularly in this notion of youth crime, has been a priority, and how has this impacted the larger policy landscape on broader criminal justice and public safety related matters?
So good morning, Lawrence Grandpre, political commentator, leads A Beautiful Struggle. It is a multifaceted response. I'll try to be as succinct as I can be. So let's level set a little bit. I think most folks know what Sinclair is, but let's just talk about it a little bit. Fox 45 was the first station that was owned by the Smith family. They've expanded nationwide. So Sinclair, this is a right-wing Republican. When Trump came in, he said, we are here to carry your message. But the problem is Sinclair, not just in Baltimore, but in many places around the country, have a diverse audience, people who are independents. This is a black city. This is a Democrat city. This is an anti-Trump state. So you need to get a Republican message in a state that's a 2-to-1 Democrat advantage in registration. So part of the focus on juvenile crime is to smuggle in conservative talking points that represent Republican politics without saying the word Republican or looking too Trumpy. So they pull upon certain basic tropes, certain conceptual frameworks that resonate across the political spectrum, but the end result is advancing conservative Republican politics in a place that is strongly Democratic. So what do I mean by that? In the American mindset, youth in general kind of have this schizophrenic relationship where they represent, in some people's minds, the best of the future, but also represent the peak of self-centered, hedonistic mindset, right? Sex, drugs, and rock and roll in terms of the 60s, right? So when you add that conceptual framework to youth, to black youth, and the idea that these folks are in environments that don't have stable families, that also are environments where the argument is that this social justice push since the 60s has so eviscerated, in the eyes of the argument, legitimate accountability in terms of sentencing for youth, because the only thing that can ever be accountability in their mind is prison sentences. The argument is that the push for liberal justices, Supreme Court cases that limit the incarceration of youth, the death penalty of youth, have basically become so soft on youth that they have no fear of going to jail anymore. That the 60s and social justice folks have gone too far left, and now these youth have no fear of going to jail. And because some of the victims of this crime are black and brown people, they can say this is about the victims. And many of those victims are Democrats, black and brown people. It's not about the victims, obviously, but it's useful to have some examples. I was at a protest Sunday for an elder who was a victim of an assault. You probably saw the assault on your social media or your TV screen. You probably did not see the rally. And you did not see the rally because this is an elder who is African-centered, Baba O'Day, who was also a member of the Black Panther Party. So part of his conceptual framework of the response is not to say lock all the kids up, but to love on them, wrap your arms around them, and do political education for them in order to give them a sense of consciousness so they don't do things like assault elders. That victimhood is not legitimate because it does not enter into just throw the cops at them, lock them up, throw away the key. So a lot of our victims have a variety of responses, and many of them look more like Baba O'Day than the person you see on Sinclair saying the kids are out of control, lock them up. But they cherry-pick the examples to make it appear that they're just for the victims. But they're not for the victims. They're for a conservative political narrative framed in the guise of being for victims of crime. Similarly, they can use youth because they can say, unlike adult incarceration, this is actually helping the youth. We're not for mass incarceration. We're not saying lock people up for a dime bag of weed. But if a young person's committing violent crime, we're actually helping them by locking them up. Because, again, the theory is the family is dysfunctional, the neighborhood is dysfunctional, and kind of similar to if you study medical racism, this idea that doctors believe black people have tougher skin and feel less pain. You need to give youth extra strong sentences, extra strong beatings, essentially, from the legal system to get it through that immature brain that this is unacceptable. Now, all the actual data and science we have on this is that it actually works the other way around. When you give a young person an extensively long sentence, they learn this system is against me. I got to get mine however I can. It actually increases recidivism. They call it the brutalizing effect. Because that's what you're doing when you're putting youth in adult facilities with adult charges. You're brutalizing them. But that violence is so invisibilized on Fox 45, but also in America in general, this police carceral state, that we still have this vision that they say it all the time, like the state needs to be like a strong parent. Weak parents get run over, strong parents get good results. But the state ain't my daddy. So I'm not going to take discipline from this illegitimate American Baltimore, Maryland state the way I might take discipline from my parents, even if that was true. The discipline from the state is a racist, violent state that I know is targeting me and my friends in ways that don't respect our humanity. And I guess the other piece I would add to that before I get to the policy impact, I guess the same thing. It's impossible to imagine the reality of black life to many people who are Fox News' target audience. So a black person with a gun is inherently violent, which means in the policy context, charges that charge that youth as an adult make sense. A young person accused of assault is inherently violent, so charging them as an adult makes sense. So in the policy context, being able to have even moderate reforms to Maryland's laws automatically charging youth as adults for over 30 charges are very, very difficult, in part because if you are a lawmaker who stands up to Sinclair's demonization of black youth, you are then targeted. So look what happened to Jill Carter for pushing those reforms. Look what happened to former DHS Secretary Vincent Schiraldi. No one wants to become the next face of being soft on crime. But it only works because it's impossible to imagine the reality of what's happening in those instances. So I'll kind of conclude with just think about it. A lot of times when you're in a fight, it's like your friend gets in the fight and you jump in to help your friend. But when you have automatic charging as adults, everybody in the fight gets automatically charged as an adult. So if you had someone who was instigating the fight, who was being a bully, who was brutalizing people, that person gets wrapped up with all the other people who were caught up in the maelstrom, maybe just falsely accused by a police officer or just jumping in to help a friend. And they all get the brutalizing effect, right? They all get put into pretrial incarceration, waiting up to 180 days to actually be adjudicated to see if they're going to be charged as a youth or an adult, because they're automatically charged as an adult. So that psychological violence applies to all those youth. And then some of those youth might then, because of that psychological violence of incarceration, be on a negative life trajectory. And what happens? See, I told you they were violent. See, I told you they were a thug. We should have charged them as an adult and locked them up earlier. When it's actually the mindset of incarceration that causes the very thing you claim to be preventing through that brutalizing effect. So in this policy environment, it's a very seductive illusion that unfortunately wraps up a lot of our people, black people as well. So I actually end there. It would not work. Even our suburbs are incredibly diverse in the city. And suburbs nationally are actually increasingly diverse. The idea of the white suburb is increasingly not true. But it's black and brown people who have been denied agency or property over their lives want agency and property over their children. And they see a strong hand of the state as an extension of them wanting to wrap their arms around their children and protect them. But that's just a co-option of our actual communal paternal desires and trying to push that onto a state that does none of that. But it's seductive for a grandparent or a parent to say, I want to protect my kid. If they're locked up, at least they're not on the street getting killed. And Sinclair preys upon that. They prey upon some of our people's misplaced desire to protect our youth, to convince us that incarceration is the only form of protection and care we can hope for. Because, as previously stated, they destroy the tax base. And anything that's actual care that's not incarceration, they call it corruption. So we have no choice but to turn to the incarceration state. So it's a comprehensive system that launders Republican politics nationwide in blue cities and blue states and purple states through this lens of, oh, we just got to care about the youth. But they don't.
So I'm gonna ask a couple of other questions that anybody can take up. And, you know, as we do that, you know, just want to prep the audience after these two questions. We'll take audience questions and contributions. So one of the things that I think is important for people to have explained very, very clearly is, you know, why would it be a successful business model to cover Baltimore this way? Like, why? What are the mechanics that make it so that the nature of the kind of coverage that we've all described, how is that, and what is the nature of the business model behind that?
Well, there are a lot of business models in Baltimore. One of them is law enforcement, which is extremely profitable for a lot of people who don't live here. And, you know, I was thinking about when I was listening, you know, about how pernicious this can be, because like 15, 20 years ago, Baltimore had a policy called zero tolerance, which arrested 100,000 people a year. The Justice Department found it was racist and unconstitutional. But the media didn't cover it critically. It covered it as, you know, a solution to crime. And that type of coverage. I didn't cover it that way. And you speak about Jill Carter, State Senator Jill Carter, who was the only person who really would talk to me about why it didn't work. But what I found was there's a political economy in Baltimore between law enforcement and some aspects of the media, because it's the exact model you're talking about. People come into the city, make a ton of money they couldn't make anywhere else, live somewhere else, and in order to keep Baltimore still putting almost all its resources in law enforcement, you need a narrative, right? That the only solution to crime is policing or military-style policing. But it turned out to be wrong, as we all know now, right? It turned out to be fundamentally wrong. And yet, the media, I think, worked with law enforcement in some sense because law enforcement brings a lot of money into the city. The city spends, $600-700 million a year, much more on schools. And, I remember talking to the late great Sergeant Lewis Hobson, because at that time when we were arresting 100,000 people, we were arresting 1,000 juveniles a month. And, the Juvenile Justice Center was packed, and he said, Stephen, we're destroying an entire generation of kids. And none of it worked. It didn't start working until we pulled back on that. I mean, look at the empty towards safe streets. Makes no sense. They talk about safe streets. I've written dozens of stories about cops who commit crimes. Every time someone from safe streets, something happens, it's like, oh, my God. We have to do 100 stories on this. See, it doesn't work. Safe streets costs about 1/100,000th of what it does to run a police department, and yet it's more effective in many ways. So there's a political economy created with law enforcement that runs this city, not so much maybe as it did. I mean, I think Marilyn Mosey did a lot to push back on that, and of course suffered because of that, in my opinion. This is my opinion. But, there's a big business. It's a big business. The lawyers, everyone's making money. And so as long as you continue with this coverage, this drumbeat of fear, and the only way to solve it is the gun and a badge, you're going to be okay. People are going to be rich. I mean, you got to understand, in Baltimore City, you can retire with a $100,000 a year pension if you're in the police department. They get take-home cars that they can drive. We're a poor city. We need these resources. And then we have a $100 million tax break to Harbor East. So why isn't the city working in some regard? I think that's why. But remember, it didn't work, and that's the big point.
So I've looked a little bit into some of Sinclair's financials. So it's a few things. First, you got to understand, in terms of advertising revenue, in general, mainstream media is a declining business, right? So they're trying to figure out a solution to the fact that people are cutting the cord, not watching as much news. And what they've realized is that to the extent there is profit to be made, it is being an advertising market, not for the city, but people in the suburbs. And they know that people in the suburbs have imbibed certain perspectives of black governance in Baltimore. It is corrupt, it has failed, and feeding them stories that basically feed their desires, like, oh, you have the hidden knowledge you can share with your people about how how people are selling each other out in Baltimore. So when you have family in Baltimore that's like, hey, they're selling you out, or you're talking to people in the suburbs like, look what's happening there, ain't that crazy? And feeding into that perceived failure of black governance produces a highly loyal base of watchers who get almost conspiracy theories at this point from Sinclair they don't get anywhere else. So they become a loyal base for people to feed the replication of what they already think is the case about black governance, is that it's corrupt, that it is wasteful, that it has failed. Which, to your point, Ashley, Maryland has a pretty good educational system, but lots of counties in Maryland are not proficient. But they talk about Baltimore City because the explicit belief that black pupils in a black city are uniquely not proficient does something for the watchers of Fox News. It vindicates what they already think is the case about the world. Similarly, Fox News, the actual stock calls will say we have a 2-year cycle where we lose money 1 year and get profit the next year. Why is that? Sinclair has realized that a ton of their revenue, nationwide especially, comes from people buying advertisements on their stations for elections. So when you cultivate a conservative, some Democrats, but also independents and Republicans, you can almost corner the market on this multi-billion-dollar political advertising space every election year. So they literally say, like, we anticipate losing money this year because it's not an election year. But when the election year comes, conservative Democrats, And Republicans will buy advertising on our stations because we have cultivated a base of voters that are looking for what they're selling. So they do this nationwide, and it's a big part of the way in which they are profitable because they become a hub for all this, millions in APAC spending to prop up conservative Democrats and Republicans, millions in corporate spending to prop up these candidates. So they explicitly say that's part of their business model is to be political. It's not an accident that they're putting out these conservative politics as part of their business model. The last thing I would raise is that it's possible it's not the best business model, right? They do okay. They're not killing it right now. And I think we have to take seriously that David Smith is so politically committed to using his TV channels as political influence networks that he will be willing to risk profit in order to pursue his political agenda. So I think sometimes people think that this is some hack they've figured out to rake in all this money. Maybe they're trying to consolidate more stations up, but it's a real possibility that he as a political ideologue would be willing to risk profit to run his stations this way because he is the influence of political power. And at this point, they may be more political engines than they are economic engines for him and his people.
And, if I can add on to that, I see that their plan is long-term, their business model, because if you think about it, when you think about question H, think about question, was it K, the term limits, and then going into trying to reduce our council size. They had a Fox-backed candidate in the school board race this time. We demolished him, and we got the Moms for Liberty candidate to drop out because I was on that. But if people weren't paying attention, and also some people are paying attention, there's aunties that I know that repeat a lot of the Fox narrative. They watch a lot more than people realize. And so when I look at even the population of the city, a lot of that narrative, how much of that impact was driving people to run to the county by, painting the story a certain way and targeting certain communities while simultaneously building up, Harbor Place and Harbor Point. Because when Local Progress came here for their convening this summer, that's where they were. They got their hotel there. They were people. We had 600 plus elected officials from all over the country. They were ready to go to restaurants and stuff. And I had to pump the brakes and tell them we are actively boycotting Atlas. And all of them had plans to go to Atlas restaurants. So while they're putting out this larger narrative of Baltimore City is falling in the dumps, all this stuff, they have a monopoly. They have a restaurant monopoly on the city, as far as tourism goes. And by driving people out of the city or being a part of that driving of disinvestment from the Black Butterfly, they are positioned very well if there was a surge of gentrification similar to Washington, D.C., when Chocolate City lost its soul, we could be in the same place and they would be positioned to be, thriving financially in the future. So I think that they do have a long game. I do think that, as far as the school system goes, I think that they're always talking about how large our budget is and never connecting it to the historic disinvestment of the school system or us having the oldest infrastructure in the state. But I think that what I also see, and I'm predicting, is that, a lot of these national charter schools want a piece of that pie. But right now, legally, they cannot get it. We have the way that we manage, approve, our oversight of our charter schools in the state of Maryland is not the way that they've gotten into Arizona and Texas and all these other places. You have to be approved by the school board, which is also why they're motivated to get people on the school board. So until they can get elected officials in place who have influence to push to change those laws, then it kind of creates that ecosystem that they are positioned to be the ones that profit the most off of Baltimore City.
And just a quick follow-up, Ashley, because I know we'd had conversations previously where you talked about some of the right-wing attempts at electing conservatives to school boards and how that was playing out in Maryland. Can you talk a little bit about that and what role Sinclair played in those races?
Ooh, okay. So I have a ton of friends that serve on school boards all over the country. In other places, I have friends that have been put they cherry pick some folks to put them on a national platform. And, I mean, these folks have gotten death threats. They really make school board work so painful for people so that, like, you know, the only people that want to do it are their people, like the conservative folks. And then when you factor in Moms for Liberty, 1776 Project, all this money is like connected. And if you get people on school boards, and the thing that I've warned a lot of senators about, because they're like, oh, it'll never happen here, it's a blue state. I'm like, it is a nonpartisan race, down ballot. And especially in our context, it's a newer race, you know, so people don't even know like who to vote for half the time. And in the state of Maryland, like the last election cycle, Moms for Liberty won 11 of the 19 seats that they went after here. So they got conservatives on all these school boards. And I got so pissed off. I told the legislators, I was like, y'all keep fussing about the blueprint and, you know, kind of poo-pooing at us and saying that we're not real elected officials. We are on the front lines of public education. Y'all want to run on an education platform? We are the education platform. Like, we're there day in and day out, like, looking at curriculum, budgets, all this stuff. And no matter what y'all do with the blueprint, if all these seats are taken by conservatives, y'all can allocate the funding all you want. That implementation could be roadblocked at every single school board in every jurisdiction if they felt like it. And that legal battle is a beast. Like, all the stuff that is baked into Project 2025 around public education, you see, like, they're defunding, like, dismantling disability rights and everything in the Department of Education. And there is no, they have, like, I think that that's where we've messed up, is that we've kind of laughed at conservatives for a long time, but they have been in think tanks and doing the policy work, the unsexy work, where people have gotten way too comfortable, especially in like blue cities. And so for school boards, we are literally on the front line and trying to hold the line. But they need to put some respect on our name as far as I'm concerned.
So Lawrence, I'm a follow-up question for you, because you talked about the way that some people might look at Sinclair and focus on the business model aspect of it, as opposed to seeing Sinclair and David Smith's activities as a part of a larger right-wing political project. Can you talk more specifically and deeply about the role that notions of anti-blackness play in the political project that David Smith embarked upon? And I'll note for the audience and those that are going to watch this later, we actually received a cease and desist from David Smith, particularly in the context of our fight against Question H. And the kind of basis of the cease and desist was we were claiming that he was racist by saying that the point of the ballot question was to diminish black political power, right? So, you know, of course, you know, so that's its own thing. But I want to talk about that because I think there's a way that it would benefit Sinclair politically to dislodge the centrality of anti-blackness from the political project that David Smith's embarked on. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So David Smith talks about seeing the 68 riots and that freaking him out. And I think that there's a generation of people who saw the rise of black electeds taking over majority black cities and felt that this was an existential crisis for what they saw as America. And when you look at black cities around the country, the ability for black people to operationalize political power, if it's seen as effective, is an existential risk for how they conceive of the way America should be ordered. So it makes sense in that world to dedicate a media engine to look at black cities like Philadelphia, well, not majority black, but largely black cities like Philadelphia, Baltimore, and frame them nationwide through this lens of inherent corruption. Right? Because some people believe that, they'll watch it, it can be profitable, but also if those things are seen as effective, if things like safe streets are seen as effective, that's an existential risk for things they believe in, like massive investment in police, right? So it isn't just that a massive investment in police would probably be good for that gentrification investments in Harbor East, because a lot of their gentrifier friends don't feel comfortable going to those places unless they're harassing youth and you see police everywhere. But it's also a fundamental conceptual vision of how the world should be ordered. If we don't have a $1 billion police budget, there is no check to the innate anarchy that's boiling just beneath the surface of America, which is the over-indexing on things like the 68 riots and viewing 2020 through the lens of the 68 riots, which I think is something very much which has happened amongst David Smith and his people, right? You know, one thing that we talk about is the former head of AIPAC, Howard Friedman, is on the board of Sinclair Media. Not Fox 45, he lives in Baltimore, but he's on the board of Sinclair Media, nationwide, right? So this conceptual vision of viewing black youth in a similar way to which they talk about Palestinian youth, that the only solution is overwhelming force and social control. That's a conceptual framework of white civilizational power that needs to be enforced through policy. So that's not natural. That's pretty bad. You have to manufacture consent for that. And by constantly telling people about, here's this vision of this one youth committing a crime, but you do that all over the nation, you have a very similar dynamic in America as Israel is trying to create amongst its citizens, where individual incidences of violent Palestinian resistance therefore legitimates overwhelming violent responses, right? And again, this is not a conspiracy theory. This is a specific person, Howard Friedman, the former head of AIPAC, on the board of national Sinclair Media. So if you look at local Sinclair News, I mean, you will see different coverage in the Middle East. You will see more of a focus on the potential violence of a nation like Iran, and that ties into the consistent vision of needing to case make for overwhelming police force here in America, right? So the demonization of safe streets therefore begins to make sense when that conceptual framework of overwhelming violence as a tool for statecraft, the only thing that can ensure stability for the country in the face of the threat of diversity, is this overwhelming force, right? I think it's important to see Sinclair and its focus on quote-unquote law and order through that conceptual framework, because, you know, similarly the focus on individual instances of the crime done by immigrants, right, non-documented peoples, could fit a similar framework to justify ICE invasions of slaves around the country, right? And again, this is a nationwide attempt to create this conceptual framework of common sense to push the political spectrum to the right. Because when they hammer this over and over again, politicians feel this false sense of common sense where it's like, well, I got to give them something. I keep getting hit. I have to give some concession to this idea of a balanced approach to public safety, which is like some police and some other stuff. But again, a state like Maryland is so far to the right when it comes to like youth incarceration. Like we're second only to Alabama to the number of youth charged as adults. That's so far skewed that they can, again, create a false vision of the spectrum where moving just a tad to the left is seen as moving so far to the left that you didn't have to balance out by going to the right again, which is exactly what happened on Westmore, and other Democrats supported repeals to some of the very moderate youth justice reforms that were passed in 2022 just a few years later. That's what the goal is to put a vicious political check on any shifting of the political spectrum to balance out this deep national shift to the right that's happened from the counter-revolution to the 60s, the COINTELPRO, the response to Black Power, the response to the student movements of the 60s, and to lock that in to make the political spectrum so solid that even a small shift to the left gets so viciously attacked that people feel they have to keep shifting right and calling it moving to the center.
And one thing I'll add is that, you know, I think one of the things that Sinclair has done effectively is take advantage of legitimate grievances that folks have with government, right? So on the campaign to fight Question H, you know, I remember talking to folks. You know, I was at one point an elected member of the Democratic Party State Central Committee. So I remember talking to folks on the committee and saying, you know, we got to push back against this Question H. And I remember folks saying to me, you know, yeah, but my council person doesn't, you know, answer the phone, doesn't respond to email, so maybe we need less. And so what I said back to them, I said, well, so let's say I take you at your word. Having less council people solves that problem, right? That sounds like that would make that worse. But the talking points, you know, the coverage that Sinclair's put out on a constant basis, I think establishes this kind of common sense, this kind of false sense of common sense that then impacts policy. on things that impact our community. But it's also important to note that holding people accountable in elected office, that is not the same as what Sinclair is doing. Right? Sinclair talks about itself as a mechanism of holding elected officials accountable. And I think it's important to be clear that understanding the way that notions of white supremacy and anti-blackness frame black folks as inherently prone to criminality doesn't mean that those of us that are challenging Sinclair believe that black folks don't engage in corruption at all, right? It is simply to say that is a frame that is often overemphasized, right, particularly on black elected officials in ways that it is not often projected onto non-black elected officials. My last question from the panel before we have the audience weigh in. So it's clear to me that Sinclair Broadcasting and David Smith is a conduit of the Trump agenda. In a state, in a city that is a Democratic Party stronghold, it seems strange to me that the Democratic Party hasn't taken an institutional position to attack Sinclair Broadcasting as a conduit of the Trump agenda, right? We see the Democrats nationally, we know that redistricting is going to happen, right? And it's described as a response to the Republican Party. So we see the Democrats in Maryland engage in a variety of fights that are aimed at pushing back against Trump. But it's strange to me that there's such a powerful media company whose owner lives in the state and is clearly trying to influence the policy landscape of the state is not an explicit target of the Democratic Party at an institutional level. Why is that?
I got a lot to say about that. Funny story. So I knew Fox, like me and Chris Papps were already like bubbling, like the investigative reporter for Project Baltimore. After we recorded him behind the scenes for that exclusive interview, stuff was already real crazy. And then I see the Moms for Liberty candidate jump in and start doing interviews about the next race. And I was talking to an elected official who's black in another jurisdiction. I will not say who. And I was telling him, he's like, oh, how's your race going? And I told him, I was like, yeah, like Sinclair's crazy. We just had to like do all this stuff. And now they're going to come after me, likely, for the school board race. And he's like, oh, yeah, let me know if they mess with you. I'll just call Alex Smith and, get it taken care of. And I was like, what? And then I started looking around to like other elected officials in the city and the number of times that Atlas or, support their events, support their campaigns. So I don't think that their perception is that they're an adversary. And I do think when you look at what folks do politically, as far as like, bills they vote against, like just shenanigans, we have a lot of folks, even those Democrats, they are acting as Republicans on the historical record with their votes. So I don't think that there's many that really stand 10 toes down against like Atlas, Sinclair, Fox. I think that they've benefited from their involvement in politics. So that's why I've been trying to tell people, look at who they talk to. Ask your elected official directly if they would openly boycott them, because that'll tell you all you need to know. Look at their campaign finance reports. Look at who's sponsoring their events for the community. They are deeply intertwined, and I think that's why they're not a target, but also it's kind of silly to be putting out a strongly worded statement about Trump on social media from Maryland as a Maryland elected official just to stick it to Trump. I'm so tired of strongly worded statements. It's not even funny, but policy-wise or, giving their money back, that's what I want to see you do. Don't put out another Instagram post. Give the money back and stop taking money from them.
I have to be honest, as a journalist, that was excellent. I think it's a little dicey to regulate media companies regardless of how we feel about their perspective. Really the instrument for that would be, I think, similar to what Brendan Carr is doing, trying to do ABC News, which is challenge the licenses, because, Fox, Sinclair have tons of licenses. But I personally don't advocate for that, just because I think once you unleash that, that can go in a million different directions. But, you know, I mean, it's interesting. I was just thinking about what everyone was talking about, the propaganda, the narrative. You know, Fox News has a drop-down menu called Blue City Crime, right? So that they use the, you know, yeah, I know. But what's really interesting to me is that crime has dropped here and all across the country, and I haven't seen any stories about the success of blue cities in tamping down crime and why, which is something that really bothers me. And I didn't mean to stray from your point, because I'm just not going to, I can't advocate for that. But, like, we need to think about that clearly, that we understand why these changes occurred. Because it's what you have been advocating for as long as I've known you, your organization. And yet somehow we as a media fail to tell that story. We continue to fail to tell it. And I'm glad you're doing this, because I just want to say that's number one. And number two, very quickly, you know, Baltimore is, David Rusk, a very famous urban planner, said Baltimore is designed to fail, because we're one of the only two independent cities in this country, St. Louis, that is not integrated into the county. And ask yourself why that is. So all the questions that we ask aren't going to be solved unless we solve that problem, that Baltimore has been created to be this isolated. And then on top of that, almost $1 billion in TIFs and tax breaks have been taken out of the city treasury to pay for developments that are owned by developers who don't even live in the city. So, you know, I think, you know, Sinclair is problematic in the way they cover things, and they use a lot of tricks that journalists can, you know, making an anomalous event into a writ large thing is something that crime lends itself to. But inevitably, if we don't change the structure of the city, if we don't integrate Baltimore into the surrounding community, and if we don't start learning what actually is working, then, you know, I don't know if it's going to matter if Sinclair has the power it has.
So I think, to Ashley's point, some people don't see 45 as uniquely distinct from other local news. Like, local news in general is like, if it bleeds, it leads. Scandal and corruption do better than positive stories that require nuance. What I think people miss is, again, 45, Sinclair, Fox News has gone beyond the typical if it bleeds, it leads public news framework to be explicitly advocating for, like, legislation, and to be mobilizing its bully pulpit as the most watched local news source to push candidates. Like, they treat Ivan Bates like he's the mayor at this point. Mm-hmm. The way that he gets, you know, people got exposed to Trump, this concept of earned media. Someone like Ivan Bates gets massive amounts of earned media and a disproportionate amount of the credit on Fox News for the declines in crime. So to your point, Stephen, people don't perceive it as blue city success because they say, no, that's getting rid of the Soros prosecutors is what was killing the crime, or Trump. And it's someone like 45 that can create the false notion of common sense that's true. Why Democrats go along with it, look at what's happening nationwide with the shift to the left of the Democratic Party, right? So there's some historian, I forget his name, that tells this, I think, ridiculous story that Maryland, something unique about Maryland makes it uniquely moderate. It's not been subject to the political swings of other places. Like, you got the sewer socialists in Milwaukee and, you know, things like that. And it's like, we are a southern state, we are a slave state, we are a blue dog Dixiecrat state. George Wallace had one of his best showings here when he ran for president before he got shot here, right? That's who Maryland is. That's who the Maryland Democrats are at their heart. And they've done an excellent job at rebranding image-wise, but keeping that conceptual framework when it comes to racialized social control at the heart of the Democratic Party. But they can't look that way because we're almost a majority-minority state at this point. So 45, with their constant focus, again, not on Trump, praising Trump, but they do a little bit of that too, kind of tipping their hand, but on this idea of youth crime and protecting victims becomes a tool about why we can't go further on criminal justice reform, why we can't go further on taxation because then people will leave, why we can't pursue a more legitimate progressive agenda that will reflect a state that has a Democratic supermajority and a 2-to-1 registration advantage, Democrat versus Republican. Right, you would think that state would be more like Massachusetts or some state that's seen as actually progressive, so we can talk about the limits of that. That's not Maryland. You know, Westmore nationwide is seen as a moderate in terms of his political stances. And again, that's part of that quote-unquote Maryland tradition of moderation, when it's really, we've always had, you know, Baltimore had the largest population of free black folks in America pre-Civil War. So we've always had to have a more nuanced form of social control in a state like Maryland that has this large free black population, this large black middle-class population in places like PG. So you have to co-opt some of those folks into some of the Fox News talking points about crime and taxation in order to legitimate Democratic Party governments that does not shake up the corporate sector. Because that could easily happen given the hegemony of like black voters in Baltimore voting for more progressive politics. So it's useful to have a check that's like, I may want to do more, but Fox News is going to propagandize and turn this into the new Schiraldi or the new scandal that's going to be something that hits the whole Democratic Party. So to protect the supermajority, we can't do it. It's like, well, what's the point of having a supermajority if your only thought is to protect it and never to use it, right?
So for people that are interested in asking questions, you can make your way to this part of the room. As folks are doing that, one of the things that I want to say, and part of the reason why LBS wanted to convene this, is because in 2027, what we're going to work on is we're going to work on a piece of legislation that will prohibit the state of Maryland from doing business with Sinclair and its affiliated companies. Now, I imagine that, I'm sure that many of you can imagine that that's going to be a really difficult thing to put forward, even in terms of getting a bill sponsor, and then certainly moving it through the legislature. And so our hope is that, we'll be making the case, and continue to make the case as to why Sinclair Broadcasting is such a harmful presence on our political landscape, and that we can't allow, and what I'm about to say is a particular message to our legislative black caucus that I believe over the last several years has stepped up in terms of being a force in the legislative landscape, that we can't continue to allow Sinclair to continue to take free swings at us, right? That we have to start going on the offensive. Because they are explicitly engaging themselves in the political landscape in a way that is not insignificant. And so that's one of the things that you'll be seeing material that we'll put out to ask for you all's help in getting a piece of legislation through the legislature that would, at the very least, not allow Sinclair and its affiliated companies to continue to do business with the state of Maryland and benefit from our tax dollars that they have. If we look at Steve and Janis' reporting on Harbor East, right, they continue to benefit from the city's taxpayer dollars while disparaging the Baltimore City and black people more broadly. So just wanted to announce that is something that we're going to be working on. And it's part of, again, why we convene this panel. So we'll start here with the first question. Just for the purpose of the recording, just say your name, if you have an organizational affiliation, and then your question or comment.
Yeah, my name is Andy Ellis, and I want to start with a story about Question H. So in 2024, Dayvon and I were down in Annapolis. We were working on a bill that would have changed the way that things got on the ballot questions. And legislators keep telling us, you got to stop David Smith, because they believe that if he could get something on the ballot, then he would be able to get it passed, which had been the case in Baltimore up until Question H. So I think that day in like January or February of 2024, we kind of decided we were going to beat Question H. And part of the way that we beat Question H is by turning the city, and a lot of people in this room probably worked on it, against David Smith, and Ash and Lawrence, and we all worked on this, right? And it wasn't about Sinclair. It was about David Smith, pretty specifically. And so that's one thing. The second thing is, I think to Lawrence's point about the bad business model, we can look at the Sun. I think the Sun getting purchased is a clear example of David Smith's political ambitions detached from whatever the business model says, because it's not really working. And they have... what word do I want to use? We'll say bad reporters at this point that have replaced all the good reporters for the most part. So I guess the question, though, is David Smith is 75 years old and has some bad practices and probably isn't going to live very long. What does it look like when David Smith is not in charge of Sinclair anymore? Who's going to take over? And how do we make sure that the fight against Sinclair stays going when so much of the anger has been directed at Smith as a person?
I think the culture would still be there, and I think whoever's next in line,
Well, there's three brothers, right? Well,
yeah.
There's four brothers. He's one, and I'm sure they're all kind of simpatico on that.
Right.
And one other one would take over, I would assume.
Yeah, for all we know, the next one's even more evil.
Because, Lawrence, they control. They have a stock that is like a special stock that has. exponential voting rights. So they will always, I think the Smith family will always control Sinclair. That's the way it's structured capital-wise, right? So, yeah, I don't think it's going to change if Mr. Smith, David Smith, left or passed away or whatever. I don't think it will change.
Yeah, I would just add to that. There are forces of capital that see what they do as useful for them. So, and I imagine know some of those forces of capital on their board, but even if they're not controlling the board, the engine of needing to manufacture consent against a black city around things, especially like police presence, in a world where Baltimore is slated for massive gentrification. Part of what's happening with Sinclair is that gentrifiers, many of them don't feel safe unless there is a massive investment in police. They don't trust Safe Streets. They don't trust the Nation of Islam. They don't trust We Are Us. They don't trust Peace Team. These people who are working class, black grassroots folks doing the work on the ground, they don't know them. They don't trust them. Who they know and trust are police. And that makes them incredibly necessary for the vision of gentrifying Baltimore. So I think that the question is not just David Smith, but the function that they serve in terms of facilitating racial capital. That's not going anywhere for sure. And we need to be sure that we're very explicit about calling that out.
And one quick thing is that, as I mentioned in the beginning, David Smith is very intentional about how he engages the political landscape. And there are certain institutions, organizations that have buttressed the political agenda that he's pursuing. And I'll name a few that I think are really important in the context of law enforcement. We're talking about the Maryland States Attorneys Association, right, who, when we're in Annapolis pushing the work that we're pushing, is often the Maryland States Attorneys Association that's on the other side of it, or the Association of Police Chiefs and Sheriffs, right? So that's another law enforcement institution that, Sinclair works in collaboration with. One of the ways you see that most obviously demonstrated is in Sinclair's pushback against the Community Trust Act and immigration reforms more broadly, where you see the law enforcement establishment come together and doing, joint press conferences in opposition to immigration policy. And so even to the point, notice stuff like Sinclair streaming their press conferences, right? So it gives you a sense that, there's an organizational affiliation there. And then, of course, the Fraternal Order of Police. So those are the institutions that, to Lawrence's point, that Fox 45 serves a key role as a media partner informally in advancing their political agenda. So as long as you have those forces present, Sinclair is going to be a useful vehicle for their political agenda.
My name is Mindy. Thank you so much for this. I'm really not sure how to state everything I want to state because you've said so many different things. Going back to the beginning, I worked for Baltimore City Schools as a family and community engagement coordinator years ago. And yes, the neighborhoods were not good. And yes, there were parents who had children when they were 17. So they were basically only, not even finishing their adolescence when they were parenting. I worked at schools where the kids really didn't have a playground because they couldn't really afford the janitor to go in every morning and yet use condoms and needles. And in the schools where there was no heat, no air conditioning. I want you to juxtapose those images to Gerstel Academy. So for those of you who don't know, David Smith is the founder, chief executive, and everything else of Gerstel Academy. Gerstel Academy is an I don't know how many acre campus out just kind of off of like Racerstown Road extended going towards Westminster. It looks like a college campus. It is pristine. The fields are gorgeous. It's all state-of-the-art facilities. He takes pride in that. And going back to what you all were saying with the tax incentives the city gives him, does he take any of that money and pump it back into city schools? Because we know that schools and teachers can really change children. And if the neighborhood isn't safe, then at least if the school is safe and if they have people they can trust in the schools. So all this tax money, so when he drives in from Cockeysville or wherever he lives, and it's interesting to me, too, because several of his restaurants, when you're talking about Harbor East, you're a straight shot down 83. You don't even have to get off and see the city. You're basically pristine. And then you turn around and go home. And so who works in those buildings? Who works in those restaurants? 10 to 1 says it's not county people commuting in. And how well does he pay them? So I think there's a report to be had here about the money that he's taking from the city that could be going to the schools. And why isn't he as wealthy as he and his family members are? And I just was Googling. Thank God for Google. I used to hate this thing, but it's really coming in handy in this meeting. Evidently, he's married to Paterakis?
Yes.
Okay.
Well, no. The other brother is married to the parents of Alex Smith, who runs Atlas. One of those brothers is married to a Paterakis.
So there's a whole lot of wealth. And I went to Western High School. Cheers to anybody who went there. And I believe there were people in my class who went to who were Paterakis. Or no, she grew up across from the bakery. Anyway, the interesting thing to me, too, is that he grew up in Bolton Hill. He went to City College. Does he donate money to City College? Does he talk about all the people who are famous? I mean, start with Kurt Schmoke, who probably was at City College when he was there. Kurt went where? To Harvard or Yale or somewhere, and David Smith did not go to college. So where are even his roots of black hatred? Like, where did they come from? And, I mean, I have friends who've graduated from City College more recently. Why aren't they, what you were talking about, he's not talking about success stories. There's a lot of success stories to be had. Anyway, this was really eye-opening to me as a white person, as someone who lives in the county, as someone who has distant relatives who went to Gerstel. Anyway, thank you so much.
Hey, Stephen, if you can talk a little, because I think some people may not be as familiar with the relationship between the Smith family and Paterakis family mechanics. Could you run that down? Yeah,
one of the Smith brothers married Paterakis, and so...
And say who Paterakis is for people who don't.
Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, God. Well, Paterakis is the family that pretty much developed Harbor East. They own the land. It was, the Paterakis family had a very successful bakery in that part of the city, down by Fells Point. And so Paterakis and I guess Mayor Schaefer at the time hatched this idea to build Harbor East, which was part of a huge deal. This is back in the 90s, where the city had committed a lot of its city land, given it to the family, said you can build this huge development, created all these sort of incentives, including the one that, what was the Marriott Hotel down there. They got 25 years for $1 a year for a $120-30 million property. So the Paterakis family basically owns and operates Harbor East, and of course they're married to the Smith family, and of course Atlas Restaurants is owned by the Smith family, which basically has 11 or 12 restaurants there. And one of the things you were talking about, education, the city of Baltimore gave so much away in tax benefits that they had to do a legislative fix because we would have lost school funding because of the TIFs and the pilots. Because basically what happens is those pilots and TIFs create more appraised value in the property. It's kind of complicated, but create more appraised value. So technically the state anticipates that you'll be collecting more money for your schools. But of course, we had given that money to developers, so we weren't collecting it. So I think about 7 or 8 years ago, they had to do a legislative fix to make sure the city didn't lose school funding due to the TIFs and pilots. So in a sense, what has happened in Harbor East could have cost our schools. It was only because the legislature in Annapolis fixed it. But yeah, so it's very intertwined. It's kind of Gotham-esque. There's these families that control like this city that is paid for by the taxpayers. So yeah.
I would say that we did lose our schools because, that's directly connected to school closures. So even though there was funding that came in to fund the school system, simultaneously, like I said, we have the oldest infrastructure. Year after year, we are underfunded $400 million for preventative maintenance, maintaining what we have. So the MOU that we had to go into with the Stadium Authority and the IAC in order to get funding to rehab these schools, to address some of the things that you mentioned, like the HVAC and not having a playground, all these things, we had to go into that by agreeing to close a lot of our schools. And I think one of the biggest problems for me, like, and I get on the school system's nerves with this rant, but I think that some of our school closures have had a direct correlation with the decline in population in the city. Because the data that I've specifically asked them is like, for every time that you close the city, what happened to the population of the neighborhoods in proximity to that school? Because I know for me and my family, like, where we decided to live was because there was a school close by. And me growing up in a small town, like, being able to have easy access to a school and, you know, just finding a neighborhood that fit was, like, really important. So, you know, as there have been Band-Aids that have been put on because of that lack of tax funding around our infrastructure. So we've lost history. Like, it's not just a matter of, like, historical preservation. It's the declining population in the city. It's declining enrollment. And it more specifically happens in the Black Butterfly, you know, because you see, like, investment in the areas that are closest to the areas that you're talking about. So, yeah, it is a whole mess. Yeah.
Yeah, so to briefly touch on the piece you mentioned about where does this come from, I don't psychoanalyze people. I can't speak specifically to him. But since I went to City College, I think that knowing a little bit about City can understand maybe what's happening with him. Because City was integrated when he went there, but again, this was like, it's not what it is now. City right now was like, 80% black, 50% free reduced lunch. His vision of the school would have been, they're still speaking Latin, still doing the pledge in Latin. And again, the narrative that folks will get is like the black folks came in, the school went down. As opposed to the fact that black folks come in, the funding dissipates because of the decline in the tax base. So it's not read as, the decline in the tax base because of people's preconceived notions of black governance or a majority black city means they had to flee. It's seen as something happened that black people didn't care. City's a beautiful school. It's like a castle. But the bathrooms don't got no stalls on them, at least not till recently. And so you can read that as like when the black people took over, look what they did. It's not a beautiful school. Right. I coached debate of City for 10 years, and, we had people like literally winning debate national championships. But if you're someone like him, you're not beating whatever school he went to. We specialize in beating them in debate, right? But you're not going to hear that. In part because what we did is we debated with a framework of social justice. So while I view that as success, he'll view that as failure. Because it's not the classical debate. It's not, classical, dignified, suit and tie debate. And when you have those racialized scripts projected not just onto a school like City, but on a city like Baltimore, where we call success, he might call failure, right? And so it's just one of those things where a lot of, people who are trained to be, more moderate centrist Democrats, the 60s and perceived engagements with black power and what they see as the excesses of the 60s and the excesses of black power shifted a lot of those folks right wing. Like I said, folks like him explicitly viewed 2020 as an extension of the chaos and the fear of 68. Even though 2020 was far, not even close to the scale of the riots in the 60s. The perceived sense of racialized chaos is so deeply embedded in those folks that's like they justify going rightward, even if they were trained to be more centrist and were experienced having black friends, going to school with black folks. Their perceptions of what the world needs to stabilize itself, again, are so based upon a view of human nature that's inherently corrupt that we have to have violence, state violence, policing in order to keep innate human nature at bay, because that's how they view 68 in 2020. We were too lax, we were too hug a thug, we were too whatever, and not the expression of frustration with deep racialized policy and wealth inequality. And when you don't have the conceptual framework, you're going to say what's wrong with these people as opposed to what's wrong with me and the society people like me build.
And can I add, there's something that bubbled up for me, when you were talking. So I think the other important context to have is that, yes, he is still involved with City College because the conservative candidate that ran is from City College, one. And then two, that is still an entrance criteria school. Mm-hmm. So while it may be, more diverse, they still get to handpick. It's operating in many ways like a private school. The population of students with disabilities is less than 5%, which is like not typical of like schools that aren't able to like gatekeep who is able to enroll. And lately, this actually happened this past week, some media outlets were talking about like they were actually using City College as an example to prop up and push down the other high schools and be like, this is where all the bad kids go. And that narrative has caused a lot of disruption. But I had to like check the person because I was like, that's an entrance criteria school. Like you saying like, oh, why is this school able to achieve this when this school can't achieve whatever? It's like, well, first of all, look at the resources and also look at being able to hand select your student population.
Hi, I'm Sarah. I live in Baltimore City. Baltimore Sun, I'm concerned about because when you open up the paper, you get to page 3 or 4. Well, then you see that the articles say they're from Sinclair or they're from Fox. So you know the viewpoint. But the first 4 pages or so, especially the front page, does not say that at all. It's just regular reporters, and yet the slant is becoming more and more obvious. It's very insidious that it's against Baltimore City, against Maryland, against Westmore, against saying people are moving out of Maryland. It just things like that. So that concerns me because I think a lot of people still read the Baltimore Sun and may not realize that they're slowly becoming brainwashed by that paper now, like they are with Fox. The first issue. And my second question is, for me, it sort of is personal about David Smith because I think a man who lives in Baltimore County has a fixation with Baltimore City and Baltimore City politics. He got term limits passed. We didn't need term limits. I live in a city council district where we didn't like our city council person, so we voted him out. It's not a big deal. We didn't need term limits to get rid of bad people. If they're good people, we want them in as long as possible, like Mary Pat Clark. So term limits hurt us, and he was able to get that done. Luckily, question H, we had more information about David Smith, so we were able to rally more people to fight against that, and we were able to squash that. But I'm really concerned he's going to do something else because I don't think he's going to stop. I think he has a fixation on Baltimore City politics and having more power and control. So just any advice or anything you want to talk about as far as how to keep an eye on this person? Thanks.
Oh, I would say yeah, what I said before, like, look at people's campaign finance reports. Look at who, like, I know y'all mentioned Ivan Bates or, you know, like, even the coverage of, like, the Inspector General. Like, all this stuff is interconnected, and I think that they are trying to make the landscape easier for them to potentially to get folks in leadership, specifically, like, the mayor's seat. I'm trying to think of who, like, definitely as many people on city council as possible, because then, you know, that's a easier way to get more handouts and all, make everything favorable to them. So I guess that's like really all we can do. Like, we don't know what they're planning on next, but I mean, he has the resources and he's always up to shenanigans. So we'll just have to make sure that, we keep communicating, but I am hopeful because I do see a shift. Like I said, like being able to stand and say, I'm going to actively boycott, like that couldn't have happened like 6 years ago. I think that enough folks know now that we need to side-eye anything related to Sinclair and Fox 45. Like that is because we've been talking a lot. So I'm hopeful that we are doing enough work and setting our own foundation that any shenanigans that he has, we're just going to reactivate the same folks and hopefully give him a stronger butt whooping.
Yeah, I would say it's important to be vigilant about your own conception of news, because there are some things that kind of scan as Fox News doing Fox News stuff, Sinclair doing Sinclair stuff. But part of the insidiousness, like I was trying to get to, is that there are legitimate concerns and grievances that they pull upon that sometimes take a little bit of depth to disentangle, right? So just for example, like stories around accused misallocation of funds with violence prevention. I mean, I think there is a lot of concern around essential things like violence prevention, making sure the money goes in the right places, but actually going deep enough and knowing people connected to those things to know what's true and what's false. Like there was an incident where they showed someone's picture claiming that someone involved in the highest level of leadership of an organization was accused of a gun crime when actually it was the wrong person. Like they just used the wrong picture, right? And it actually takes like being able to know people and know what people look like, and and they didn't issue a correction, of course, right? But that's the level of because otherwise, well-meaning people would say, well, I guess maybe there's something to it. If their leadership is committing gun crimes, then, but it wasn't that, right? So it takes a level of deep connection and engaging community. Because, I mean, just for example, there were bills in the state legislature this year that were called nonprofit transparency bills. And they were clearly targeted at grassroots violence prevention organizations. And they literally just repeated Sinclair meaning talking points back when the Republicans testified in favor of them. But they were just seen as like nonprofit transparency bills, and they would have put ridiculous levels of overhead and requirements on people who got state money that was specifically targeted to make it difficult for small grassroots nonprofits to get state funds. And that's a level of sophistication that they have because they're tied into this think tank machine, because they are very strategic about what narratives they lift up, and by coding legislation in ways that don't read right wing. Right, so it's important to stay plugged in, like with folks like LBS, because we testified against those bills, and we talked about stuff like that. Folks who are trying to like really expose people to the nuances, because again, like they're very, very intentional about lifting up these very seemingly more benign narratives as opposed to the more explicitly anti-black narratives.
I think it would be really helpful if the community would ask Sinclair and their stations to disclose their ties to the city every time they go on the air. Every time they report a story in Baltimore City, the first thing is to say, we do business with the city. We benefit from tax breaks from the city. Full disclosure. I mean, that has to happen. So, and if we push for that, I think it would put them in a position to have to explain themselves a little bit more.
One quick thing I'll add is a part of why for us it's important to put in legislation to bar the state of Maryland from doing business with them is to put them on the defensive. And I think that it would raise the conversation with just, regular constituents, as to, why it's important for the state to just not do business with them at all. I think that is going to really help to raise the visibility of the issue in a way that I think will help push back against the influence of Sinclair and David Smith.
My name is Susan Russell, and I've really learned a lot from today, and I want to thank LBS for sponsoring. If what I'm asking was already answered because it went over my head, I apologize for that. But I wanted to know if it's true that a big percentage of African Americans in Baltimore City watch Fox News, and if so, why do they, since it's so, negative against black people?
That's a very good question.
I definitely, okay, so I was wondering the same thing, and just observing them, like they are the only one that has like regular news like on all the time. I think that's one thing. So people have like plugged in to like listen to the weather or whatever, like the things in between that aren't as malicious and crazy. So because we don't have like a strong alternative, I think that's one reason why people listen to them. And then two, like I know that stat is probably very factual because like I said, there's people that I would never guess, like, I mean, lifelong Democrats, aunties in the community that, could not disagree more with Fox, but still listen to it. And then there's this other group of folks. I'm probably a little bit in that group because I kind of want to know what they're up to. So I'll watch it like as background noise and be cussing them out like while I'm watching, but just to like get an idea of like what type of message, so that when I'm dealing with like constituents or like people in the community, I know how to be proactive or to counter or give them the right information to counter whatever misinformation they're putting out there. So I do think because we don't have a strong alternative, especially on TV and radio, that has been a challenge. So I do think that there's a bit of a monopoly on the city.
I thought when I was there that there was, in the African American community, a feeling that the Democratic establishment had let them down and screwed them over, and that we were the one station that wasn't complicit with the Democratic establishment. I mean, that's what I felt. That's when I was there. I don't know if things have shifted, but, because we would hold Democrats accountable, or at least I would. And I think other reporters did, and I think that was appreciated at that point. But this is before crisis, city in crisis, and all that stuff. And I think that was part of it because, we all know that's kind of like what happened. So,
Yeah, I think that the way that their news, like how recurring it is, and like when oh God, what is that called? There's one program that they do that covers nonprofits. So there's nonprofit. Yeah. So there's a portion of it where they give like the community a platform where the other news stations don't do that as often. So it's like this weird relationship where it's like, oh yeah, I can call them and they'll do this story. But also to your point, like when something goes bad, immediately the community's like, call Fox 45. Like they'll give them hell. They'll represent us. And I'm hoping like that shifts a bit by, first of all, elected officials, institutions like stepping up and like doing constituent services better. But I think that is the only news station that I see from my perspective and as a community member where the community can give information to them, see it reported back to them in a much different way than like the CBS's and the other ones.
Yeah, I mean, at a very simple level, like they have a national news empire, but they're based here. So they have resources in there because Baltimore's in some ways their flagship. It's in some ways their petri dish where they test out messages they didn't send nationwide. So if you're looking for Annapolis coverage, other stations kind of do it, but just as a ratio. Fox 45 does so much more of it. You feel like you're actually getting more local news in terms of state government from them because they do it more. Now, they do it with their slant, but if you want it, there's nowhere else to go to get that degree of depth of coverage and consistency of coverage, right? So just like all of them are aggregating stories from national media and mixing it in with local stories, but because Fox has more product to offer, if you want to feel like you're staying in the know about what's happening locally, you go to Fox because, again, they have the resources to do more of it. Yeah. I would also say, just to try to do it briefly, for me, it makes sense to think about the actual logic as to why people get into conspiracy theories to get what's happening with Fox. People think that people are stupid when they get in conspiracy theories. It's actually the opposite. There's a vision that there is this knowledge that will help protect me and my people that is secret and hidden, and I have to unveil it. So that's the value of what conspiracy is. It makes you feel like you're doing something to protect your people. And Fox feeds into that narrative where the viewer can feel like they're learning the secrets of Westmore's military records or the nonprofit stealing your money or whatever it is that's actually helping to explain why your life is so messed up. They're giving you answers, right? Other people are just giving you news. They're giving you answers to a feeling you have that something is wrong. It's the wrong answer, but the other people aren't giving you any answer, right? So they're really weaponizing people's correct understanding that something is deeply wrong, and people are not telling me the truth, but they're framing it through the lens of their political theory.
And they did invest a lot of money in Project Baltimore. They do hire like producers and reporters, so they have put a lot of money into that.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I'll just say quickly to that I think, particularly the question of like black folks watching it, and I've seen some of the data, but I don't have it on hand to quote it. I'm inclined to believe that it is true. And I think a big part of that, I think there are two reasons. One, as was alluded to, that the Fox 45 local affiliate is able to drive coverage and impact the other media companies in the ecosystem. And so I think a part of what has happened because of the resources that they've dedicated and the ability for them to impact the larger local media ecosystem, I think a part of what that means is that for a lot of, and this bleeds into the second thing, which is for a lot of our community, this goes back to something Stephen mentioned, suspicion about the Democratic Party establishment in general. And I think that there are aspects of our community that sometimes, in the absence of viable alternatives, right, will seek out a more conservative perspective because it challenges the Democratic Party establishment. And I think that speaks to, the complicated relationship that black folks have to the Democratic Party, where we're the most loyal voting bloc. But, folks are disappointed with what is often being delivered by the Democratic Party establishment. And so you often will sometimes see people, I've seen a handful of, media content where folks will say that they voted for Trump just really out of frustration with the system, right? Not even having a strong ideological commitment that drove them there, but just like, I'm sick of how things are. And so I think that Sinclair Media, to Lawrence's point, is tapping in to the fact that people are frustrated. And when you're the person or the community, then in many respects is like the end user, right? Like we're the ones that are most impacted by the policies. Then anything that sounds like it is addressing those issues sounds appealing. So I think it's just it's in addition to local media and the resources to do local news, it's also like local media that actually will explicitly challenge the political landscape. It is just unfortunate that Sinclair is taking advantage of that and using that in service of a right-wing political agenda.
Thank you so much. My name is Ann George. I have a long history. I was born and raised in Baltimore City. I was a teacher at Western High School for 17 years and then department chair at Poly. But I have to first say, and I would define myself as a good, necessary troublemaker in the John Lewis era. First of all, I'm very impressed. I'm so happy to see you guys. Where have you been for the last year and a half? Because we've been, a group of us here today, we've been protesting and taking action against Sinclair and David Smith for, I guess, almost 2 years now. But I think one of the things that I'd like to point out is one thing is what Sinclair is doing to Baltimore City, but also we haven't discussed the fact that you don't see things on Sinclair, on Fox channels, which is, I think, over 200 channels in the country that they influence, that you see on other channels, particularly MSNBC and even some of the other regular channels. Because, like, when Trump goes cray-cray, you don't see it on Fox. So I really think that a lot of this is, he's getting through on that other thing. We haven't really talked about that. But as an activist, how can we respond to this? I want the people in the audience right now who have been to a demonstration against Fox or Sinclair. Could you stand up real quick or raise your hand? Atlas Restaurants. Fox 45, we have a whole get-up. We have signs ready to go. We're ready to go. We just need activists to participate and make this all aware. How do we do that at this point? I also want to say that I was on the Democratic Central Committee for 2 elected terms, so I know where you're coming from, and I don't see much hope there, quite frankly. I thought my time could be better spent making good trouble. Thank you.
Are y'all the ones that stand out? Yes, I honk every time I say y'all. Yes. I love y'all. I think one of my, give them a round of applause. I think one of my takeaways, like I said, I intervened in that convention, where they had all these elected officials come in to dine in places, stay in hotels down in Harbor East. I think that's a place, as we see conferences come in, telling them that we're boycotting Atlas. It was so quick for them to tell everybody in the cohort, do not go to Atlas. Here is the list that Ash gave us of all the Atlas restaurants. Don't you do it. So I think that there's ways that we can hold conventions accountable. I know the Kappas are coming whenever. Are they being told not to eat at Atlas? Holding other people that are here, that are traveling, that are feeding that whole ecosystem. I think, we can do some shenanigans there.
Can I just say something? I'm a reporter I've covered Annapolis a lot. almost every progressive policy initiative in the past decade, LBS has been at the center of it down in Annapolis. So I just wanted to give you guys a shout out because what they have done is extraordinary. And any reporter who covers Annapolis know it's all about the money down there. You know, you have these rich, powerful lobbyists, and they're all going out to dinner. But you guys have really been at the center of it, and so it's extraordinary. And I shouldn't say that because it sounds like I'm compromised, but it's true. It's true. So.
Can I just say one other thing? I think your idea of getting this from the state level means that it opens up us to the state legislature for the whole issue.
That's right.
And they're like, we don't have something to go to them about. So go for it.
Yeah.
Or you could do a piece of legislation that if a media company receives a tax break, that they have to disclose it from the state, or any incentives have to be disclosed somehow in their broadcasting to make the public aware of their conflicts of interest, which I think would be perfectly reasonable, and not telling people, reporters or journalists, what to say, or even Sinclair, but at least be honest about who we're getting money from. We're benefiting from this city that we are also covering.
Yeah, what's up, y'all? Thank y'all so much for this panel today. My name is Presence. I'm a member of Black Alliance for Peace and the All African People's Revolutionary Party. I find it so surprising how many people don't know about the extent of the nature of the continued effort to keep Africans in a state of oppression. Over west where I live, when I talk to residents, many are shocked to know about the continued work to build a $330 million police facility in Cobbin State. There's several killings over just the last year, including a 7-year-old woman killed in her own home having a mental health crisis, and the continued increase in police budget despite crime going down. Learning through this panel, Sinclair represents a key aspect in the battle of ideas and other mechanisms of the white supremacist capitalist state. So my question for y'all is, what narrative do we need to make clear when it comes to the long-standing attack the state has been waging on black and Africans in Baltimore City, and what are some of the ways we can effectively reach the masses who are most affected by these narratives and policies rooted in white supremacy?
I think, I know I mentioned Project 2025 earlier. Like, I'm not giving it praise, but I think that that's what I see a lot of times locally, is that we're on defense a lot in the things that are being passed or pushed. We're on defense in the ways that we're trying to tell elected officials not to vote yes on things. So for me, I'm like, what would it look like for the folks closest to the issues to actually sit together and put together our own like comprehensive plan of like what we want to see and like dream of the world we want to live in through policy. Like, I don't think that we've been proactive enough and like painted that picture, because we don't really have a clear like larger narrative that's out there that people can like grab and like articulate like what is the alternative. I think we're seeing it with like Safe Streets and folks, but like if we were to redo the whole city, like a whole comprehensive, the way that we do the budget, we're having conversations about even the way that the budget process works. Like at a certain point, the what is it called, where everybody comes in to give testimony for the budget night, taxpayer night, that used to happen at the beginning of the budget cycle and had more influence on the budget. So yeah, I just wonder like what systems things, how can we all get together, think about what the systems are in place that actually give us power so that we're not always on the defense, but actually like playing more offense.
Yeah. I think it's a variety of things. I think it's independent media being able to go to the people who it can reach. I know you were at this thing this weekend, the protest for the Baba who was assaulted. Like, I'm going to turn that into a podcast, and that's going to reach who it reaches. It's not going to reach a ton of people, but those people are then going to reach other people and be credible messengers in their networks. So I don't know if we have the ability to have mass communication on the scale of Sinclair, but we do have some outlets like black newspapers and black radio to be able to have a better messaging. But I think a lot of it's going to be Just like there are credible messengers in the violence prevention space, there are credible messengers in the youth services space. And many of those are working class black folks that have dedicated their life to youth, that have seen some of the failures of the juvenile justice system, but haven't quite put together the nature of the attack being waged by people like Sinclair and the forces trying to criminalize our youth. So I think part of what we want to do is reach out to the people we know have worked with youth extensively and make them credible messengers for challenging Sinclair's propaganda. Dayvon and I were at a play last night from Wombworks that was explicitly about the nature of juvenile incarceration, juvenile justice, and not listening to our youth and criminalizing them. And that's something that everybody should see. But unfortunately, we don't have the capacity to make that something that can play all over the city. But the people who are in that Wombworks extended universe, the people who work with coaching youth football, the people who work with, youth who are formerly DJS, sort of getting them to speak to people in their networks and then giving them pieces of information, whether they be podcasts or panels like this that we're going to post online to begin to hopefully consolidate a shared understanding. That's not total uniformity. We're all going to have our differences, but a basic understanding that whatever Fox is doing, we know we can't do that. Accountability is going to have to look different than what they're putting forward, because we know that's not about accountability. That's about criminalizing our youth for their own political perspective. And that's going to help peel off some of the people that get sucked into, well, we got to do something to help the youth. This is something, and we have to give them an alternative to that.
Last question.
Yes, this is kind of piggybacking off of what he had to say. We know who they are. We know what they are. So what are we going to do about it? And that's as simple as that. We can be the mosquito in the tent, if you understand that metaphor, because something small can make a big difference. But the question is, what are we going to do about it?
So that's a great way to transition to the closing. So what I mentioned before, so LBS is going to work on a piece of legislation that would ban the state of Maryland from doing business with Sinclair and its affiliated companies. We're currently working to get bill sponsors for that piece of legislation. And that'll at the very least make it so that if you're an agency head, you're not doing retirement parties or any kind of convenings where you're paying Atlas restaurants, right, where you're not, selling advertising, onto the Sinclair channels. And so that's really for us the next step. And so we're going to be putting out information over the next few weeks, asking for people to share the material that we put out as a part of our broader campaign to get the legislature to take up this issue. We're actually in works in getting a conversation with the chair of the Baltimore City delegation. And so that's going to be a conversation where a part of that is going to be about sponsoring this piece of legislation. We're going to work on getting the Legislative Black Caucus to take this up as a legislative priority in 2027, given the unique impact of Sinclair Broadcasting against many of the issues that impact our community. If you have not signed up to receive LBS's newsletter, lbsbaltimore.com, that is where we put out our action alerts, where we'll keep you up to date on the efforts that we're engaged in as it relates to this piece of legislation that I've referenced. Before I actually proceed even further, let's round of applause for the panelists this afternoon. And I want to give each of them an opportunity to either just say some closing words and then maybe talk about some relevant work that you're engaged in. I'll start with Steve and Janis, and we'll just come down the line.
Well, we've been covering Capitol Hill and inequality because we think economic inequality is the existential issue of our time. But I would love maybe, State Senator Jill Carter introduced a piece of legislation a couple of years ago about tax break transparency to form a state a state board to examine tax breaks, how they're offered, who gets them, and have a centralized location for people to go and access it. And I want to talk to you about that because I think it's something that could go a long way to putting Sinclair on different footing in terms of having those incentives exposed so that people know where this money is going. And we'd like to talk about that.
Thank you, everyone. Great questions. Right now I'm just focused on running for re-election. Election day is November 3rd. Please vote. Pay attention to school boards. Support school board members. And I think the thing that I would like to see is folks support the Baltimore Beat, other credible messengers, And also as far as like young people being able to, like, they have tons of stories. Like the students that I talked to that were like, oh, Fox trolls us all the time. They think all these things about us. Like they had tons of examples of like amazing work that they're doing. They're able to be storytellers, but investing in programs that give them the resources to become journalists, I think is really important so that, you know, we have our own folks that can tell our stories rather than allowing somebody to extract and manipulate anything that's happening in our communities. Yeah, keep telling people that Sinclair and Fox are trash, because I feel like there's still people out there that don't know and like innocently listen to them and repeat things that they say and don't necessarily connect it to the larger right-wing agenda. So, yeah, just keep talking to people. Put it on Facebook, all the places. You know, if you see somebody eating at Atlas, drag them out. Like, all the things.
And so LBS, we're LLC, so this isn't a nonpartisan thing. Say a little bit more about how people can support your campaign.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I have a campaign website. It's www.ashleyesposito.com. You can see my whole platform out there. I really nerded out on it. And any questions you have, like, you can reach out to me, and I'm very responsive and accessible.
So as political commentator, part of my responsibility is to produce content that helps expose some of these concepts in more depth. So in terms of local Sinclair and their impact, we have one podcast called Political Commentary Corner, where I break down stories from local media and many times directly responding to Sinclair and other local right-wing media, sort of exposing some of the ways they're trying to shape the political discourse. So you can look that up on YouTube or you get podcasts. We have another podcast called In Search of Black Power, and that's sort of different folks, myself, Dayvon, Rasheem was in the audience doing conversations on larger, more theoretical concepts, national, international politics. So In Search of Black Power is also wherever you get podcasts. So in terms of shifting the narrative, I think a good example of that is I Am Rasheem, documentary Beyond the Wire. So really deconstructing some of the mythologies around Baltimore, talking about the people who are actually doing the work to decrease violence. We're actually, for folks in the room, there's going to be a showing Here's the Real News next week on Saturday at 3 p.m. And so for folks who are watching this online, please reach out to the Baltimore Legacy Project so you can schedule your own screening of Beyond the Wire, because just like the play from Moonworks, these are independently produced media that challenge the narrative of Sinclair directly and really forefront the reality of what's actually happening on the ground, which is what you're not going to see on Sinclair media.
Can I just say one thing really quickly? I'm so sorry. We have a documentary called Tax Broke that we did here at The Real News that I would urge anyone to watch who wants to understand how much tax breaks define this city for developers. It's on Amazon and Tubi. So I just want to say that because it gives you a good background. Tax Broke. Tax Broke. Yeah.
And donate to all of these nonprofits.
So as we transition, Lawrence actually stole my thunder. So there is the showing of Beyond the Wire next Saturday at 3 p.m. here, where you'll get exposed to many of the folks that have been central to the declines in violent crime and homicide in Baltimore. I also want to encourage people, as I kind of started to talk about, sign up to be on LBS's newsletter, to receive the newsletter in order to get information about our efforts to challenge Sinclair. Also, LBS is explicitly not a nonprofit organization, which allows us to more directly confront the political landscape. And I think a part of why we've been able to be so, affirmative and forthright in challenging Sinclair is because we're structured in a way we're an independent black political organization, right? So we're beholden to our base. And so, if you're interested, please consider signing up to be a sustainer. At this point, we have about a little bit more than 300 people that sign up to give us money on a monthly basis that helps us sustain our work so that we can maintain the independence that allows us to be the kind of force that can do things like be a part of the work to stop Question H and some of the other work that we've done in pushing back against Sinclair. So, again, Dayvon Love, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, thanks for coming out. Please sign up. If there's more information out the front, see you all later.